in just a few minutes. We'll give everyone a few minutes to come in. 6 p.m. is a hard time of day for some people, and then we'll get started. Thank you for coming out.
And the milestones of science was Einstein represented. I didn't see him. I'm glad he's here today.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for bringing up the Milestones of Science exhibit. I think maybe the best way to start off is to thank the Buffalo and Erie County Central Library for hosting the event today. We're so fortunate to be across the hall from the Milestones of Science exhibit, which will be up for about another month. The exhibit has primary texts of scientific milestones from all over the world, so it's really a global collection of the global scientific community, and we're very proud to be housing it here in Western New York and to have Buffalo be part of the global scientific community.
We just did this like went to the Catskills, but 4 days. And so we're doing all and I think being in the except that's a family thing. So it's like it's not the same. It's just even for her, right? It's just
Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So thank you again, everyone, for being here tonight, and thank you to the Buffalo Erie County Central Library for hosting us tonight across the hall from the Milestones of Science exhibit with primary texts of scientific literature from around the world. And also thank you to Organizing for Action for bringing this to our attention as an issue that we could use our platform to talk about. That was a wonderful partnership that was created by Organizing for Action, organizers coming to our events, and we're very thankful for that partnership. So without further ado, my name is Elizabeth Schiavone. I'm the Public Relations Chair for the Buffalo March for Science, and today we're talking about immigration and innovation in the region. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about immigration and science in the region. And then I'm going to pass it off to our wonderful panel, who I'll be thanking individually throughout the evening, who come here to speak with us from their experiences as immigrant scientists and legal professionals and healthcare professionals. So Western New York, without the Einstein, the idea was conceived because we saw this come up a lot during the March for Science, that Albert Einstein was a refugee, and to forget that in our current discourse about immigration and what we care about in the scientific community is to forget a big piece of our history. So Albert Einstein was a physics researcher in the area that would become Nazi-occupied territory, and his work was interrupted by anti-Semitism. So he moved to the US to work at Princeton and continued working with his wife for visa applications and testimony for German Jewish refugees. And this was very much a part of his life. A quote we don't see from him as often is, "I am privileged by fate to live here in Princeton. I'm almost ashamed to be living in such peace while the rest struggle and suffer," alongside all of his other inspiring quotes about science and technology. So at the time, Americans were not particularly enthusiastic about letting in refugees from World War II. We want to think of our history as a great people in this global war. But in 1983, less than 5% of Americans surveyed thought the US should help refugees coming out of that conflict, and 66% thought they should be kept out. And a year later, their thoughts on child refugees were very similar. So there were fears of refugees coming out of this conflict coming over as saboteurs and spies against the US. And there was a very careful screening process that had to end when the US entered the war because they closed their consulates in those occupied territories. So today, we see 12% of practicing physicians are immigrants, 50% of PhDs in engineering are immigrants, 40% of masters in computer science, physical science, and engineer are immigrants. So why is that? We have actually an incredible demand for workers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We have full employment among people with those advanced degrees among US citizens. And when we talk about having the best possible scientific and engineering workforce, we need to talk about reforming education and immigration because our education system is not producing enough high-tech professionals. And when we think about the next generations of blue-collar jobs, they are going to be more directly linked to innovation than ever. Coal miners are currently being retrained as computer programmers, which have salaries that were comparable to salaries they could have enjoyed in other industries at other points in history. But when the offer for that went out, there was one group that was doing it. They had 11 positions and hundreds of former coal miners signed up. So in Western New York, we're actually among the top 5 research metropolitan areas that request to bring in highly skilled immigrants in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So H-1B visas, which we'll hear a little bit more about later, are temporary visas for highly skilled positions. And the national cap sometimes gets boosted up, sometimes doesn't, but employer requests always exceed the number of available visas, and science and technology and engineering and mathematics always account for more than 2/3 of the requests, and those requests are followed by the healthcare industry. And as I opened with this slide with, Buffalo is among the top 5 research metropolitan areas requesting for this, so not only is our national education system not producing enough high-tech professionals, Buffalo's area in particular is not, and not producing enough people who will stay here or persuading enough people to come here. And then there's what we don't hear a lot about is that immigrants create jobs. They're twice as likely to start their own businesses compared to non-immigrants. For every foreign-born advanced degree program graduate in the US, 6.2 jobs are created. 18% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants, and between the years of 1995 and 2005, a quarter of tech companies founded in the US had at least one immigrant among their key founding team. So presently in Western New York, immigrants make up 8.6% of the population, including their children. That's 10% of the population, and this was after a 33% increase between the years of 2000 and 2010. Between 2003 and 2014, Erie County resettled almost 10,000 refugees, and we currently receive 1/3 of the refugees that come into New York State. And something that's been noted among this population is that their young people are more likely to stay in the area than people born in this area. And what's presently at risk is Buffalo's historic role as a welcoming city to immigrants. This is a quote from an Iranian postdoctoral fellow researcher in fluid mechanics at UB. When the travel ban temporarily went into place earlier this year, he was separated from his wife and 6-month-old when they were denied re-entry into the US after they were visiting their family. What he has to say on this is, if a majority of the US does not want Iranians here for work or other things, okay, no problem. We'll go back to Iran or go to other countries where we can do our job. So I just want to take one moment before I pass the mic over to our speakers here today to talk about who are Western New York's Einsteins, who decided to come here and give the gift of their time and dedication to Buffalo, and who might we have been keeping out if we were not welcoming to them. So Dr. Eli Ruechenstein is Romanian and a polymer material chemical engineer. He was expelled from school and forced into labor by a fascist government due to race laws, and then attended university under a communist government before coming to the US through an NSF grant for visiting scientists. And he's been working at the UB School of Engineering and Applied Sciences since 1971, and has received national accolades for his work in science. Annie Gwendel, I apologize to her family if I have not pronounced that correctly. She came to the US in 1947 and was a senior computer programmer for 20 years in Cheektowaga and resided in Hamburg. Walter P. Chrysler came to Buffalo to join Bell Aerosystems and developed a guidance system for rockets, and started a corporation around those devices that are still used around the world today. And he also developed the Steno writing system, which is a shorthand writing system that he made based on shorthand German, and it's used in many industries today around the world. Dr. Timing Chu came to the US as a graduate student and worked at Roswell Park, where he developed the PSA test, which is a test that can detect prostate cancer at an early stage. There are currently 2 million prostate cancer survivors in the United States, and the test is taken by 20 million American men annually. Dr. Alexander Jaberski came to the US, got a doctorate from UB, and then as a Canisius College physics professor, improved the quality of TV and radio transmissions. The snow, he helped get rid of the snow. And then John B. Kopczynski held over 40 patents. He was an avid inventor and passed this on to his son. He started St. Mary's Manufacturing Corporation in Tonawanda. The company had a high of 250 employees in 1980 and closed in 1988 with 50 employees. And then Dr. Randir Bansal joined Praxair in 1977 with a work visa after doing a PhD at Georgia Tech in mechanical engineering. And then he started AirSep Corp in Buffalo, which is the largest manufacturer of oxygen concentrators in the world. He created 600 Buffalo-based jobs and brought in $750 million into the region from sales. So, and then we also have Dr. I've been instructed how to pronounce this.
Satyan. Yep. There you go. Dr. Satyan. That'll do it.
Okay.
That's all we say.
That's all.
Lakshman.
Right? Lakshman Rushma.
Lakshman Rushma. There we go. And he is currently the vice chair for research in UB School of Medicine and Pediatrics. He's trained over 40 physician scientists, is responsible for bringing $2.2 million in clinical and research funding into the area, supporting 30 positions at the university. And he's considered to bring the best care to Western New York newborns. So here's the references, but I'd like to hand this over now to Dr. Roseanne Berger, the Senior Associate Dean for Graduate Medical Education and Associate Professor of Family Medicine. She oversees the training of 63 residency programs sponsored by the Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences and is affiliated with hospitals throughout Western New York. We're so grateful to have her here today to talk about international physicians in Western New York. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. I want to thank June Chang for bringing me here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot about what Elizabeth was discussing, but from a narrow perspective of my world in graduate medical education. But I think it illustrates a lot of the points that you were making earlier. And this is a slide I show a lot when I speak to our residents about the globalization of health. And we've learned pretty quickly that healthcare and is really global. It's not local. Just remember the Ebola crisis, and something happened, and before you knew it, Erie County Medical Center became the hot zone for Ebola, and everything was dropped. And right now, the exact same thing is happening with measles in Europe and polio, and it goes on and on. But the education of healthcare professionals is actually also a global phenomenon. And we here in Western New York are frankly the beneficiaries of having the opportunity to train many wonderful physicians who come from all over the world. So as Elizabeth mentioned, in Buffalo, we now have 64 programs. It keeps growing. And we have about 800 residents and fellows, and we're affiliated with essentially all of the major healthcare centers here in Buffalo, the 5 major health systems, and which includes a link out to a rural community, Olean General Hospital. So how do all these residents get here? It really happens in a 2-step process. One of which is known as the match. And if you've ever watched the Buffalo News or picked up a newspaper in March, there's always these wonderful, exciting events where people wait with bated breath to find out the result of a computer matching program that literally matches every single medical school graduate in the United States, well, the majority match in the United States, as well as it's the same system that is used for graduates of foreign medical schools who really want to come to the United States for their training. And for years, they wanted to come here because the United States was viewed as the best place to get advanced postgraduate medical education training. So in 2017, that was this year's match, there was a lot of anxiety, frankly, because the match is in and of itself a contract. If you register for the match from both an institutional perspective and from an individual perspective, you are essentially signing a document that says, if I match, I will go to the place where I match, because you're going to match with only one, if you match with one location, and the institution is not allowed to offer your position to anybody else without getting a special waiver from the National Resident Matching Program. So in essence, you've signed a contract. And one of the things we were all concerned about is that the institutions in the United States may be reluctant to select the best candidates for programs if they were international and if they came from certain predominantly Muslim countries. And so then the match occurred, and this follows sending in applications, interviewing, reviewing these applications, and we had over 35,000 applicants that were vying for about 31,000 positions. The majority are for the first year positions. PGY is postgraduate year 1. And as typical, about 94.3% of all U.S. graduates from allopathic schools, there's allopathic and osteopathic, matched in the first round. That's what these percentages look like. Because if you don't match in the first round, there's a secondary cycle. And 81.7% from osteopathic schools matched. And then we got into the international graduates. And so there are U.S. citizens who go to international schools. And then there are non-U.S. citizens who go to international schools, those who are international citizens of the world. And in fact, what happened was that the match rate, and you'll see it's lower, it's about half for both the U.S. citizens and the international students, remained similar to what it had been in prior years. Actually, the match rate for the internationals, the non-U.S. citizens, went up a little bit. The number of applicants from these countries, all of the international countries, actually went down a little bit. We don't know the reason. That could be public. All you had to do was read a newspaper, and maybe some of the applicants had the same reactions that we were fearful of, and said, maybe I'll sit it out this year and not apply. But in essence, it didn't really occur that we had a major reduction in the number of international graduates who came to the U.S. And this is just a depiction in a different form. So over the years, this is from 1982 up to 2015, you see there's fluctuation, but both the U.S. international grads and the non-U.S. international grads have kind of gone up a little bit. So this is actually a look at UB, and this is introducing the idea of part 2, because remember, part 1 is the match. Part 2 is you have to get a visa, and I think there's an attorney in the room who will probably be able to speak to this better than I. In UB, we accept our first-year residents, those who are entering the postgraduate year 1, with the visa known as the J1 visa. And that visa is sponsored by the Exchange Commission, ECFMG, the Exchange Commission of Foreign Medical Graduates. And it is really intended for those who are going to come here and train. And my understanding is that when it was first developed, there was a concern about bringing people from across the world and then having them not go back home. And so would we actually be creating a brain drain from other parts of the world and actually worsening healthcare in countries that really need advanced healthcare? So a component of this J1 visa is that there's an obligation that when you complete your training, you're going to go back to your home country 2 years. So that's one of the issues. This is just to show you that here at UB, we have representation from 24 countries in our first year class, and they include some of those countries that were of concern to the public, or at least to the executive. So when we look at all of our residents, remember I told you we have approximately 800 residents. We have approximately, again, a quarter of our residents are coming from, they're non-U.S. citizens from across the world. And these are just the numbers that come from the top 10 countries that are represented, India being the most represented, but and Canada, that's so close. But Pakistan comes in with quite a large number, China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Iran, South Korea, and the UAE. And so, Elizabeth, we wanted our Iranian trainees to come here. You'll see that a small percentage are coming on that H-1B B visa that Elizabeth mentioned earlier. And that's actually sometimes very coveted by medical school graduates who are internationals, because that does not come with this 2-year home residency rule. It's a more expensive visa, and there was a time when it was felt that the expense of supporting the H-1B visas would, number one, be a concern about retaining people who perhaps should go back home to help contribute to healthcare, and number two, not be in the spirit of the visas that are intended for medical education, because they are coveted and they are supposed to be for people with very special talents. So, as I mentioned, we have almost 20 some odd percent of J-1 visas here in Buffalo. But this is just to show you that in New York State as a whole, there are approximately, almost 1,700 now J-1 visa holders. And the reason I showed you this, number one, is the number is increasing a little bit, so there's still an interest in coming here to train. But number two, it's to let you know that many of the people who come from other countries and are non-U.S. citizens really do contribute substantially to our health care. They are taking jobs that many of our graduates of American medical schools find less desirable. Jobs in underserved urban communities, jobs in rural communities. So this morning I was talking to my husband, actually. We talk sometimes, and he was down in Olean, where we have a family medicine residency program. The Olean Hospital has a rural track of our family medicine program, and they are trying to increase the number of family medicine residents so they can actually take care of the population in Olean and in Cattaraugus County. And he said, so the CEO of the hospital said, so where are the U.S. graduates? We have to get, we have international graduates, but we have a problem. And the problem is that in order for some of these J-1 visa holders to remain in the United States and not go home, and once they go home, it's much more difficult to have them return, they need to get a waiver. And that waiver is called the Conrad 30 waiver program. And the 30, in my mind, refers to the fact that it doesn't matter what state you live in, but there are only 30 waivers that basically permit you to not return home and to take a job in an underserved area. This has been an area that many of us had tried to lobby for, to change the number of waivers to help address this healthcare shortage in urban settings and in rural settings. This has been really problematic. So New York State trains more residents than any other state in the country. We only have 30 waivers. Idaho or Wyoming train much fewer, and they have 30. And where do many of our residents go who really want to remain in the United States, are willing to work in an underserved area? They leave New York, they leave Western New York, and they go out west, where the odds of getting one of these waiver jobs is better. So that's a challenge for us. And this is what I was saying, that there is a shortage, and particularly in primary care. We know from a Haney study that was done that family medicine and general internal medicine and any of the primary care specialties are in great demand, and that's really, when we talk about transforming healthcare and the new high quality, low cost, preventive medicine focused healthcare, we're really talking about primary care physicians, and that's really a challenge. So this is just going back to this match data quickly to just show you that these are the positions that were offered in family medicine and were filled, and the bottom line is the dotted line is the positions that were filled. So for some reason, we have to think also about why people aren't going into primary care. So when Tim Finan down in Olean says, where are the U.S. grads? Well, they're not entering the primary care specialties, and therefore we really need to have our international graduates help us with our physician shortage areas. So many people will say, well, do we really want to settle for being cared for by a non-citizen graduate of an international medical school? Are we really going to get the best quality care? And there have been lots of studies that have looked at things like the board scores of graduates of international medical schools as opposed to U.S. citizens who go to Caribbean medical schools as opposed to graduates of U.S. medical schools. And frankly, on those kinds of metrics, the international graduates not only perform well, but perform favorably above those other groups. But this study is particularly interesting because it actually is looking at outcomes. It's looking at the quality of care that's delivered by graduates of international medical schools as opposed to U.S. medical schools. And they looked at hospitalist services. In other words, these are physicians who basically live in hospitals and take care of hospitalized patients who are incredibly sick. And it compared the outcomes based on their readmission to the hospital and their mortality. And they looked at the two groups. They tried to make sure there were similar populations. Actually, it looked like some of the comorbidities in the international groups were a little higher, and they were a slightly sicker group, and maybe it's because they were in underserved communities. But the outcomes actually showed that the care delivery was the same for really both groups. Whether you were a graduate of a U.S. school, you were a graduate of an international school, the outcomes were essentially the same. One study actually made it look, this one actually made it look like the outcomes in terms of mortality and readmission were even a little bit better for the graduates of the international medical school, but then there are other studies that actually say they're about the same. So this is not a quality issue. So I'm going to really just circle back to the same sort of thing that Elizabeth talked about, which is we have so many examples all throughout the university and healthcare of people who are really leaders, educators, wonderful scientists, and they come from literally all over the world. And trust me, I was only limited by what I could fit on one slide. I could have gone on for just, thousands of slides, but we don't want to do that tonight. So I do think that this is an important issue. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm glad you're taking it on.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so the one pivotal question I have is, in this March, the match was not influenced by the political demographics. Do you have concerns about next year's match in terms of?
So let me backtrack a little bit. When you look at the aggregate data, it didn't look like it was influenced. I can tell you that I anecdotally know of institutions that made decisions to not rank people from the 7 countries that were identified, because what it means is, because of this obligation, there could have been, they might not have been able to come, and it might have been a delay of 2, 3, 4 months before a resident could be hired in their place. And residents are a major part of the workforce, sure, particularly in these, in urban academic medical centers. So anecdotally, I think there are examples where it did influence it, but when you look at it in the aggregate, it didn't. And yes, I am concerned.
Well, the match decision was really made after all the applications came on board, I mean, right? And the travel ban, excuse me, was made pretty close to the same time.
So
a lot of the match decisions.
So ranking you couldn't change any of the ranking after February.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berger. So next we have Nicole Hallett, who's an assistant clinical professor of law at the University of Buffalo Law School. She directs the Community Justice Clinic representing low-income residents of Buffalo, and her research focuses on the intersection of immigration, labor, and employment law. So we're very happy to have her here today to talk about this.
All right, thank you. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a professor. So I'm gonna look at this from the legal perspective, and I thought that it might be helpful just to give a little bit of background on what has happened over the last 6 months and where we are today, because there have been a lot of developments, and you might have seen a lot of things in the news every day. There's some court has done this, another court has done that. So I just wanted to kind of give everyone a background so that we could all be kind of on the same page in terms of what is happening. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of zoom out a bit and talk about what I think is going to happen in the future, so that we can talk about really what effect this, the policies that the new administration has put into place are going to have on science more generally and on the STEM fields and research more specifically. Okay, so everyone's heard of the travel ban, I assume. It's gotten some news. Okay, so January comes, we've got a new president, and within just a week or two, he puts a couple of different policies, immigration-related policies, into place, and one of those has come to be known as the travel ban. This is just kind of a side note. There was actually a ton of other stuff that came out that same day. He issued 3 executive orders related to immigration, and many of them had really wide-ranging effects on the immigration system as a whole. The travel ban got most of the press, mostly because there were people stuck at airports and there were people mid-air who lost their visas and things like that. So it was a very high drama situation when it went into effect, and so therefore it got most of the press. There are many, many other policies that I think are going to have a more subtle effect on immigration in general in this country, including legal immigration and employment-based immigration that haven't gotten so much attention. But I did want to talk about the travel ban in particular, mainly because you all know about the travel ban because it made news. And the entire world knows about the travel ban also because it made news. And I think one of the themes that you should take from my presentation is that the actual policy is important, but the signals that that policy sends are perhaps equally or even more important in the long term. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the short-term effects, and then we can kind of talk about the long-term effects as well. Okay, so January 27th, Trump issues an executive order. That executive order, again, does many things. For the purposes of this conversation, I think the most relevant thing is that he banned travel for foreign nationals coming from 7 countries for 90 days. Okay, so this was talked about as a travel ban. It was, but even on its face, it was supposed to be a very temporary ban. It was supposed to be 90 days, and the justification that the government came up with was that, as Trump would say, we don't know what the hell is going on. We need a pause so we can try to figure out what is going on. And then we'll put new procedures into place and we can move forward. But from the very beginning, there was widespread concern in the legal community that this would not just be a pause, that at the end of the 90 days, there would probably be an extension, there would be another ban that went into effect. There was a lot of concern that the list of countries would grow. And in the early weeks after the ban went into place, there were lots of rumors that would spread. There was very little information being released by the administration. So, for instance, there was about a week in early February where there were rumors that Pakistan was going to be added to the list of countries. And in looking at these countries, there are many students from these countries and many professionals and other individuals from these countries in the United States, but there are many, many more people that are here from Pakistan. So it was one of those things where we were constantly trying to figure out what was going to happen next, because what happened is when the travel ban was put into place on January 27th, it went into effect immediately. There was no period of time to, implemented, so to speak. And so there were people who got on an airplane in a foreign country, and by the time they landed, the travel ban had gone into effect while they were in the air, and they were stuck at airports. And therefore you got these press reports of protests that were occurring outside of airports, and legal advocates who were actually going to the airports to try to make sure that people were permitted in. Okay, so, and this is my field, the legal profession. We did what we could. We filed lawsuits. That's something lawyers are very good at. There are many things we're not good at, but filing lawsuits is one of those things that we are good at. So advocates all over the country immediately went to court and filed lawsuits. Lawsuits were filed all over the country, some of them within 24 hours of the ban coming into effect. So you can imagine what that 24 hours was like for those people who were filing those lawsuits. And courts acted very, very quickly. And in many different parts of the country over the next couple weeks, courts put injunctions into place that stopped the travel ban from being implemented, okay? So there was a period of time in February where supposedly the travel ban was not supposed to be implemented by the administration. Everything was supposed to be normal, okay? Now, as this is happening, the Trump administration, maybe having learned some lessons about mistakes that they made in the first travel ban that made it hard to defend, issued a new travel ban. And it was mostly the same. There were a couple of differences. Iraq was taken off the list of countries, so we have 6 countries instead of 7 countries. And they did things like they exempted green card holders, which received a lot of criticism at the time, that green card holders wouldn't be able to travel outside the country. But most of the order remained the same. So it was a 90-day ban on individuals from the 6 countries. Okay, so one other thing that the administration did differently with the revised ban is that they gave a period of time before which it would go into effect. And that gave people time to file new lawsuits. So we have new lawsuits. The main action actually moves to Hawaii. So the main lawsuit that has been kind of going up through the courts since then has been in Hawaii. The travel ban, the revised travel ban, was then blocked by a judge in Hawaii. Throughout April and May, it goes up through the appellate courts, and there are several appellate courts that uphold the injunction, meaning that they don't believe that the travel ban is legal. And then in June 26th, it finally makes its way to the Supreme Court. On the last day of the session, the Supreme Court leaves part of the stay in place, and it lifts the stay to some extent, and I'll explain what exactly happened. But essentially, the Supreme Court kind of split the baby. It said, even though every court up until that point had ruled basically the entire executive order unconstitutional and illegal, the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to allow parts of it to go into place, into effect, and parts of it we're going to continue to stay until we can hear the case. And the relevant distinction, and this is important for this discussion, is that the Supreme Court held that the administration could not implement the travel ban with respect to individuals with a bona fide relationship with a U.S. person or entity. And this was really important because many of the actual plaintiffs who filed these lawsuits around the country throughout the course of the spring were people who were associated with universities, such as students and researchers, professors. And those individuals, it was clear from the Supreme Court opinion, those individuals are deemed to have a bona fide relationship with a U.S. person or entity, the entity being a university, or if it's a private company, it would be the employer of that person. Okay, so what does that mean for the population of people that we're talking about today? So we're talking about people in STEM fields who are either students here or researchers, professors, or employed by private companies in these fields. So there are sort of like two levels that I want you to think about this. So first, there's like the actual stated policy, and then there's how the policy is actually being implemented. Okay, so just to kind of think through this question, why do you think that the administration issued an executive order that announced the travel ban, as opposed to any number of other ways that they might have implemented this policy? Does anyone have any ideas? They could do it by themselves, right? But why did they? So, you know, let's run through some options. They could have sent a secret State Department cable transmitting the travel ban to the consulates without making it public. They could have issued new trainings for their consular officials, which make it much harder for people from these countries from entering. They could have issued regulations that would have taken time, obviously, or they could have done what you said, which is issue this public proclamation of the travel ban. So why do we think that they chose the public route rather than all of the secret ways that government often enacts policy that we don't necessarily know about?
Well, this doesn't fulfill your promise to the base if you do it in private.
Exactly, right. So this was as much a public relations move as it was a policy move. And the reason why I think that is because there were many, many other ways that the administration could have enacted essentially the same policy, which would have been much harder to challenge because it wouldn't have been public. Okay, courts are very, very deferential to decisions that the government makes, particularly in the realm of immigration and national security. And so one of the things, I don't know if Rick's going to talk about this, but you know, one of the principles is called consular non-reviewability. Okay, that means that if a consular official makes a decision in some consulate in some country and you don't like that decision, it's very, very, very hard to get that decision reviewed by a court. You're basically out of luck, right? The reason that they were able to, the courts were able to review the travel ban is because it was so public, because it was a statement that contained all sorts of red flags that the court could then decide, well, this is unconstitutional. It's essentially a religious ban. They could have basically enacted the same policy without actually making the statement that they were doing the policy. So in some ways, even though I think you're right, it was to satisfy the base, it left them open to legal challenges. Okay. So why is that important? It's important because even though now officially the injunction is in place with respect to these 6 countries, on the face of the government's policy, there was a State Department cable that went out after the Supreme Court decision that clarified that if you're a holder of a student visa or a work visa, you are exempt from a travel ban because, as the State Department said, a bona fide relationship to a person or entity is inherent in the visa classification. What that means is no one is getting these J visas or H-1B visas or F-1 student visas. No one is getting those visas unless they have a bona fide relationship with an individual or an entity. That is what makes you eligible for the visa. So on its face, it seems like the population that we're talking about is exempt right now from the travel ban. What we don't know is how consular officials are actually enacting that policy at the consular level. And there can be a lot that is done to restrict legal immigration from these 6 countries and from countries across the planet that doesn't depend on the executive order, but merely depends on the ability of a consular official to make individual decisions on each case. And they can be getting all sorts of guidance that we don't even know about what kind of standards to put into place to make sure that their vetting procedures are adequate. Okay, and so, you know, the decision-making process at this point has become decentralized again. It became centralized for a very short period of time with the travel ban that went into effect. Now that the travel ban has been stayed with respect to most visa holders, we now have a situation in which we have a black box again. But this is actually no different than any other period of immigration. This is actually a return to normal, okay? Normally, immigration decisions are made in a black box, and we don't know, very much about why a decision is made. But the problem is that we now have an administration that has indicated their intent Their policy has been blocked for the most part, but they have many, many other avenues to use in order to accomplish the same goals. So we should be glad that with right now, those people are permitted to enter the country on the face of the policy, but that shouldn't make us feel like the fight is over, to make sure that we actually have a system that works for our medical profession and our, the STEM fields that need people from these countries and from across the globe. And this was just, I saw this in The Guardian, and I just wanted to use it as an example. This was July 11th. So this was after the Supreme Court decision went into effect. And it's a story of an Iranian cancer researcher who was going to do research at the Harvard Medical Center, who was not permitted to enter the country even though he had a valid visa. Now, it's unclear why this happened. Of course, this kind of thing happens all the time. And it could be totally unrelated to any administration policy. It could be that there was some problem with his paperwork, right? But we shouldn't, think that because the travel ban has been stayed, for the most part, that means that the people in these professions are not going to have problems entering the country. All right, so I just want to look ahead, kind of like just a few months to like what's happening with the travel ban. Like right now it's stayed, but it's a temporary stay until the Supreme Court hears the case. Okay, so I think we have a couple questions, and this is the future, so I'm opining here. But I think one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, will the travel ban be moot by the time the Supreme Court hears the case in the fall? Okay, moot basically means that the case is over. There's no longer a controversy, and I'll explain why it might be moot by the time that the Supreme Court hears the case. The Supreme Court won't hear the case until October, because that's when the term begins for this coming year. Now, there was a question that the travel ban, like I said, only was good for 90 days. All right, and the idea and the way that it's been justified is that they needed time to review their vetting procedures. Okay, now there was some question during the course of these cases about whether the government was actually doing those whatever they needed to do to review the procedures while the case was ongoing. And the government's position was, we haven't been able to even begin the review because we've had this injunction into place and we don't want to violate the court order. The Supreme Court made clear that the government is expected to dare review while the court is on break and before the court hears the case. And the Supreme Court made clear that they expect that review procedure will be complete by the time the case is heard in October. That, to me, sent a very strong signal that the Supreme Court is at least hoping that this is moot by the time it hears the case, and it can dismiss it and say, great, you've done your vetting procedures, the ban has been in place for 90 days because we let it go into effect for some limited purpose, and let's all move on, and please don't give us another case to consider, right? This is not the kind of case the courts like. It's political, it's complicated, involves national security, involves immigration. This is exactly the kind of case that courts really, really don't want to do anything with. All right, so then the question is, what's the administration's move? Do they issue a new travel ban that's perhaps longer and not temporary, longer than 90 days, based on whatever their review revealed? And if that's the case, then probably there will be new challenges that are filed to that new travel ban if that's the case. All of this leads to a lot of uncertainty, right? Right now it's fine, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and they can keep trying, right? Like the government can rescind this executive order and try again next month, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think particularly for people who might be affected by this ban, there is this sense that we don't know what's going to happen next. Right? We don't know what it's going to look like in 6 months or a year. And when you're someone who is coming here for a graduate program, who is coming here for a residency, who's coming here for a job, you don't want to be told that, well, you can come in now, but in 6 months, we don't know what the situation is going to be. That kind of uncertainty, it makes it very difficult to do planning, life planning and whatnot. So that kind of leads me to the broader issues and long-term concerns, because I think whatever happens with the current travel ban is really only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can expect. We heard that so far, at least, it looks like in the medical profession, the match rate didn't change this year. I would be interested to see what it looks like next year. I think that'll give us a lot more information about whether we are going to see an effect, because I think it happened during the process, and I don't know that we could actually see, people had at least least started the process of applying by the time the travel ban went into effect. And so I think it's possible that we'll get more data next year that will give us a better idea. But I did find some statistics that suggest that it perhaps is already having an effect. These graphs are a little bit hard to read, but essentially what it's saying is that they did a study that surveyed different undergraduate and graduate programs in STEM fields. And it looked like at least 39% of undergraduate programs reported a drop in applications from the Middle East, and 31% of graduate programs report applications from the Middle East. That's just this year. And that's really unusual because the general trend in education is that international applications are on the rise across the board. So this is unusual. It also looks like there was some drop from other regions as well. Not just the Middle East, that was the largest drop, but there were other regions as well. So, you know, the way that I want to end this is that, you know, the travel ban is a policy and it's being fought legally, and it's going to come out, it's going to shake out one way or the other. But the signal that policy sends, I think, will have long standing repercussions for the STEM fields and for this country as a whole. And I can say, I know that the plural of anecdote is not data, but I have spoken to many people from these 6 countries and other international students at UB who really feel like it's a betrayal of the promise that they received when they decided to come to this country. And I think what we're going to see long term is that there's going to be a push for international students to decide to go other places. Canada is just across the border. We have lots of world-class institutions in other countries that are willing to take the students that we reject, or that they reject us because they decide that it's not a welcoming environment for them. When we think about these policies, we should think both about the practical effects of what's happening right now, and also the effects that we're going to see over the years of, you know, STEM fields who are no longer competitive, and innovation suffering because we're losing really good people to other places because of the signal and the message that these policies send. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. So Rick Sue is next on our panel. He's also a University at Buffalo School of Law professor, and he writes and teaches in the areas of local government, law, immigration, and federalism, and he is coming at this as the son of Chinese immigrants. He does not have a slide, so if he wants to speak from there, he can, or he can come up to the mic. Thank you.
So I'll be the outlier here, it seems, given that I'm not using technology. Probably not good for a STEM presentation. So it's an honor to be here to talk about science and immigration. And although I stand before you as a legal scholar, someone who studies these issues and have been doing it for about 10 years, from immigration law and also local government law, I actually draw a lot of my remarks from my own personal experience. I am not a scientist, but I can say that I was almost a scientist. I went to college thinking that I would be a physics major. I enrolled in the physics track. I was in the honors program. There were 80 of us when we began. And as we went down the track to physics 1, physics 2, thermodynamics, atomic physics, the class got smaller and smaller. And when I got to quantum mechanics, I looked around the room and I realized I am now the dumbest guy in the room. Let's get an English degree. On the other hand, although I am almost a scientist, I am an immigrant. So I immigrated to the United States when I was 6 years old. And although I like to say that my family were good people, I think in many ways we were not necessarily the most desirable immigrants in the way that we usually do the calculus. Neither of my parents were college graduates. My first memory of my mother in the United States was hunched over an industrial sewing machine where she was doing piecework. And although I think I turned out okay, I have to admit that I was not necessarily a good kid. I think the first year I was in the country, I was caught stealing mail from my neighbors. Within about 2 years in the country, I was caught twice shoplifting. All those was happening at a time in which many Chinese immigrants were swarming into the suburban community in Monterey Park in LA. And there was a lot of backlash. So I think if you asked any of my neighbors, who would you want to deport? I might be on the top of the list. Now, what's interesting about my background in both science, but also as an immigrant, is I think that this particular conversation that we're having reveals a lot of different complexities. Because one thing I learned from my brief stint, if you will, in science, besides the fact that I can't do the Schrodinger equation, is the fact that there's something very unique about science. Because one thing I learned very quickly in that field is that it is in itself international. That it is a collaboration between many people in many countries, beyond cultures, beyond race, beyond religion, all coming together to pursue knowledge and truth. And not only were they doing so together, but often many of the international organizations, these efforts that we have, from the Large Hadron Collider that discovered the Higgs boson, or the World Health Organizations, or Doctors Without Borders, are ways in which various researchers and people in the science community and medical community have come together regardless of our understanding of what may divide us. And they're here to do human problems that isn't necessarily useful for one country or another, but the human population as a whole. Whether we're trying to solve the problem with hunger, or cure diseases, or in recent days, climate change. But one thing I learned as well from being an immigrant is that science, although it transcends many of these human conditions, if you will, only occurs within, in some ways, a human context. That in order to have an environment in which science flourishes, you need to have an environment in which there's free exchange of information, free exchange of people, so that they can collaborate and work together. And that in order to have that environment, it's in some ways beyond science. We have to understand in some ways how our political institution is set up. What kind of immigration system do we have? And does the immigration system and the nations that we're talking about give the kind of opportunities for this kind of collaboration to occur, but also for individuals to pursue their goals and pursue their dreams, and in other words, get together and discover what truth may actually is to help the human species. Now, I think America's done quite well up for the past few decades with regard to this particular component. I think we've prioritized science and innovation not only as a core to how we drive the economy, but in ways how to make life better for all of us. And I think in some ways we have, for the past several decades, seen immigration as a boon to this country, their ability to attract some of the brightest, some of the most ambitious individuals to this country to not only collaborate with one another, but also to work on these particular issues in the United States. And the truth of the matter is, I myself, having not been a very good child, enjoyed the opportunities that this country was able to give me. And as a result, I think was able to succeed. And I think in some ways we've done that in the science field as well. However, I think as you're hearing, and the reason we're here today, both of these are under attack. We've heard a lot about how science in some ways is under attack from the administration, but also in some ways the general American public as a whole. And certainly connected to that is also immigration. And there's been a rise in sort of anti-immigrant sentiment, and the idea that whether or not immigrants actually contribute to the society, or whether or not they merely displace what would be good for this country, thought about very narrowly in terms of US citizens. Now, in some ways we've heard a lot about the concerns that are rising up contemporarily, and I don't want to repeat a lot of the things that my co-panelists have already stated. But I do want to think about the broader picture and think about what is going to occur going into the future, and what, if anything, we should do about it and think about it. Because I think what we're seeing, even with the confusion that's coming out of the travel ban, is that in some ways there's a broader shift in American society with regard to how we think about both science and immigration. On the other hand, I think the confluence between the two, science and immigration, has not actually been that well established. So in terms of the political machinery or the political mobilization about this issue, there really isn't a lot built up there. So what are we going to do about it? I want to sort of approach this question from three separate perspectives. And in some ways, I want to reach far. And in some ways, I will be introducing ideas that may be kind of controversial in some ways. And I hope it prompts a discussion afterwards. The first thing I want to suggest is that we have to abandon some idea of complacency. I think for a lot of researchers and scientists and individuals involved in that particular field, the idea of going to science is to transcend and get away from all these sort of human concerns, if you will, that they are in pursuit of a pure goal. But I think the truth of the matter is, in order to have the environment to actually pursue those goals, there has to be a lot more awareness of the political environment and the legal regime that's being set in. And I think one thing that's very important here is to bow away, if we will, from differentiating or from deflecting in ways that I think in some ways has been common among high-skilled immigrants. The truth of the matter is high school immigrants, for the most part, occupy a very privileged position within the immigration spectrum. But I think the problem with this is that when the anti-immigrant sentiment starts building, in some ways no one is safe. Now, to go back to my childhood once again, I think I learned this through my childhood when many times when I was attacked, if you will, by racist comments, my first instinct was to deflect or to differentiate. When I was growing up, and of course I wasn't necessarily a great child, and I was accused of being a Jap, and I was told about as sort of accused for Pearl Harbor or the sort of influx of Japanese imports at the time, my first instinct at the time would be to deflect and say, well, I'm not Japanese. In fact, I'm Chinese, and Chinese people have grievances against Japanese as well, so we're okay. Or if I was called a gook, and with that I was somehow responsible for the Vietnam War or the Korean War, I would say, well, I'm neither Vietnamese nor am I Korean, as if those people would deserve the insults, but myself. And of course, when it came time to say that, well, the problem is that you are Chinese and there are problems with Chinese immigrants, my first instinct was, well, I'm not really Chinese, I'm Taiwanese actually, so it's a little different. Yeah. What I learned is that the more you deflect and the more you differentiate, the more you actually contribute to the particular problem and the more it builds. Because of the matter, if we are going to live in a society in which these kind of intolerance or kind of differentiation is going to be the basis upon which we make decisions about one another, in some ways, no one is safe. And I see this a little bit in the STEM fields as well. Because I think that there is an impetus, for example, when Chinese researchers get accused, as Wen Ho Lee was, of espionage with very little evidence, that it was easy for many other people to say, well, I'm not Chinese, so that's okay. Or when Indian IT workers get shot because they are brown or they're accused of outsourcing of American workers, maybe other people would say, well, I'm not brown, so that's not a problem for me. Or when Muslim researchers or workers get excluded or harassed in the country, I think it's very easy to say that, well, I'm not Muslim and therefore that doesn't affect me. But the truth of the matter is, I think when it comes to anti-immigrant sentiment, when you start playing the kind of tribal game that I think is escalating, it doesn't matter what kind of research you're doing or what kind of work you're doing or how you could differentiate yourself in one way or another. In some ways, everyone will be implicated, and not only immigrants in general, but in some ways, America as a whole and how we think about our country. And I think this extends not only to specific racial categories or religious categories, but also to divisions I think that we sometimes see between high-skilled immigrant workers and low-skilled immigrant workers. I think one thing that we have to acknowledge is that even low-skilled immigrant workers have skills, and they often fill particular economic niches. And what is important, I think is important to think about is the more that we differentiate between particular skill levels or sets, in other words, to protect our own, the more we may be contributing to a particular political rhetoric that in the end will not save anyone. The second sort of approach I want to think about, and this may be kind of radical, is whether or not in focusing on the national debate over immigration and thinking about immigration as a national issue, or forsaking a particular area of mobilization that is possible, and that's at the local level. Now I say this not only because in some ways I feel like although there should be a national policy on science and there should be a national policy on immigration, I feel like it's lacking in both regards at the national level. At the same time, although I feel like there's a lot of abdication at the national level, cities are really stepping up to the front. Now this could be a recognition that when we think about immigration, we're not really thinking about one big national interest. In some ways, the concerns about immigration and interest in immigration varies from community to community. And in some ways, cities have been thinking about this for a long time. The fact that, for example, Pittsburgh is now thinking about artificial intelligence or robotics as their focus, or the Silicon Valley is thinking about tech, or Cleveland and Buffalo is thinking about biomedical. These are different interests in their particular regard, but they are particular interests in which science is imagined in terms of how the city wants to conceptualize itself and see its urban future. And I think if we were to recognize in some ways that when we talk about immigration, that it is in some ways a number of scattered local conversations in various communities about their particular interests and needs, and in some ways brings it back to a way of thinking about it that isn't so distant. That we can be having these conversations at the local level, even if the decisions are going to be made at a national level. That in some ways that the national conversation could just be an agglomeration or an influence by these particular local conversations themselves. In fact, I think there's something very unique about having the immigration conversation, especially with regard to science, as a series of local conversations. Because I think too often in the national conversation, we get into sort of fear-mongering or stereotypes about immigrants out there somewhere. But when we bring the conversation to be about how immigrants are contributing to this particular community, or the immigrants that you know as your neighbors, or your coworkers, or your family members, that somehow the conversation sounds different. And if it's a series of those conversations, we may be able to come to some sort of understanding of where we want to see immigration going. And the third thing I want to suggest, however, is that also, in particular, this kind of era gives us a thinking about avenues for reform. There is a lot that we cannot, at the local level, do about immigration. But we shouldn't forget about a lot of the things that can be done with regard to immigration at the local level. And especially with regard to STEM, I think it's important to think about, once the immigrants come here, do we have a community that is welcoming to them? Do we have the opportunities? Do we have the sort of environment in which they can flourish? For refugees that come, many with high-level skills, do we have the pipeline and the certification to recognize those skills and allow them to really live up to their full potential? And especially in Western New York, I think that there is a tendency sometimes to think about our growth and our prosperity and our future in terms of getting people who've left Western New York to come back. But can we think about in terms of recruiting new people, about immigrants who have chosen to come here, and whether or not we welcome them and accept them into the community? The third thing I want to leave with in some ways is slightly different than I think the traditional way we think about high-skilled immigrants. And that's the way to oftentimes defend them is through what I considered oftentimes a very transactional way of thinking about it. Now, maybe it works. We are currently operating under a transactional president. And the way we think about immigrants, I think the way we defend them is, well, what are you bringing to the table? What kind of taxes are you going to end up paying? What kind of jobs you're going to create? I think those are all very important. Don't get me wrong. I think those are very good ways for a lot of people to sort of think about those issues. But I'm also concerned that going forward that we miss in some ways the bigger picture, not only in terms of how we think about as America, but also in some ways the tangible policies that we build. Because what I'm afraid is that if we do it entirely in a transactional format, then guest worker programs, temporary worker programs, UAE-style sort of recruitment in which 90% of the population is temporary foreign workers here to serve a particular purpose and then leave, may be the future that we're headed into. And I don't think that is the environment that built the scientific revolution and innovations that we had in this country. I think as individuals that came and settled down roots and felt welcome, that became very important to how we think about it. So I want to conclude in some ways by saying, I think it's sometimes easy, especially for high-skilled immigrants, individuals who engage in science and the STEM fields, to not think these issues are important. But we have to understand that the environment in which we are able to do this kind of work is dependent in some ways on the political structure that we have. And I think political mobilization and being concerned about these issues, or certainly just at a minimum having a discussion, is important. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for capturing a lot of the intersections we wanted to talk about here tonight. That was wonderful. Thank you. And the last person on our panel is Ines Stuckert. She is a part of the Buffalo March for Science, and she is a R&D industrial processes researcher who's born in Venezuela, and we're very happy to have her share with us tonight.
Thanks, Liz. I work on research and development, but I also am not using any technology today. And for once, I'm not going to give a talk using graphs and equations. Today, I'm just going to share with you some stories about studying and working in the US for the last 9 years. Some of these things have happened to me and some to other immigrant friends, people that I know that have moved to the US and other countries. So hopefully this will give you a better understanding of what it's like to be an immigrant working in science and engineering. I was born and raised in Venezuela. I am the granddaughter of immigrants as well. My 4 grandparents left Europe in the mid-1950s, escaping the depression after the World War, and they moved to Venezuela at a time when it was the most promising country in Latin America. The economy looked good, the beaches are amazing. I went to school at Universidad Simón Bolívar for chemical engineering. At one time, this was one of the highest ranked universities in Latin America. But by the time I went there, it was already suffering from lack of funding and resources. It's still completely free. I got my engineering degree for less than $100, but it's no longer ranked that high. Because of funding constraints, during my time at the university, I was using the same lab equipment that my dad had used there in the 1970s. There were probably less than 50 computers in the whole campus that had internet access. That's 50 computers shared between 10,000 students. So these numbers may seem so low when you think about American universities, but they help illustrate the gap between the challenges that I had back home and the opportunities that are available to students and researchers in the US. In 2008, I applied for graduate school. I was accepted to a couple of universities in the United States and in England. Being a good engineer, of course, I had to create a spreadsheet that I was comparing the pros and cons from all the different places. But it became very clear when you look at typical metrics like the number of students per professor or the funding dollars per student that the United States was the place to go. This is the place to work on research for now. Would I make a different decision today when I was looking at universities, based on the current climate? Maybe. On top of everything, in my decision to come to the US, the university paid for me to visit the Ann Arbor campus, to meet with the professor, to visit the labs. After I saw that there was no way I could go anywhere else, I fell in love with the town, with the university, with the research work that was being done there. Years later at a conference, I met a grad student from one of the British universities that I had considered. He knew my advisor well, he admired her work, he would have loved to work for her. This guy that lived in the UK was jealous of me and the opportunities that I had in the United States. And this is one of the first times that I realized how lucky I am to be here, and I knew that I had made the right decision for my career. When I applied for a student visa to the US, I knew it was going to be a long and arduous process. Chemical engineering is considered a very sensitive area, and the background checks are exhaustive. But what I wasn't prepared for was that even after classes had started, I still had not been approved for my visa. I received it more than a month after that. By that time, I had already deferred to the next semester and started a second visa application. So I was already falling behind all my future classmates. And this was my experience with those black box consular procedures that we heard about earlier from Nicole. I have to admit that my first semester in the US was tough. I missed my home and my friends and Venezuelan food. My English wasn't as good as I thought, and the classes were hard. I didn't do that good in my first series of exams, and I wasn't feeling too confident. I had come to Michigan with the intention of doing a dual degree, and I was discussing this with my academic advisor once, and he told me, "You're competing with students from MIT and so many other top colleges. It'd be better if you just focus on what you're doing right now and forget about that." He meant that I was not good enough, that I couldn't compete, and that I should limit my options. This came at the worst possible time because I was already feeling so low confident about myself. So I accepted it. I didn't even protest. Now, when I look back, I know that I finished my PhD with one of the highest GPAs in my year. Yes, even higher than those MIT kids. And I was one of the first ones to give a conference talk or to publish a paper or to graduate from my class. I could have easily taken on more work, and I did in the form of extracurricular activities. But I didn't push myself enough to take all the other classes I wanted because other people didn't believe that I could. And I think sadly many immigrants are seen this way by their prospective teachers or employers. We're sometimes perceived to be at a disadvantage because of our background and not be able to compete with our peers, even though we've already gone through so many hoops to get to where we are. Once I made it into the engineering grad program, there were still many challenges to being an immigrant in academia. There are very few grants and fellowships that you can apply for if you're not an American citizen. And getting those awards is not only prestigious and great for your resume, but for many grad students, it also means that they don't have to teach extra classes to pay for their tuition, and they can just focus on research instead. As an immigrant, it is also harder to get visas to travel to other countries. So much of the research work we do is based on collaborations with other groups and universities around the world. that traveling and attending conferences are a crucial part of life. I've seen immigrants being passed over and not given the opportunities to travel or participate in a project because it's more convenient for an American citizen to travel. And it's also harder as an immigrant to apply for internships and jobs. Not everyone wants to sponsor a work visa or a green card application. It's tedious work and it's expensive. Companies are taking risks by hiring an immigrant, investing time and money in training them, just to lose them after a couple of years if they don't get that green card or that visa after all. However, companies also have a big need for these researchers. As Elizabeth presented at the beginning of today's talk, immigrants form a large fraction of those candidates that companies are looking for. And for every project that a PhD in my company is working on, at least 5 non-PhDs are also employed. So there are lots to be gained from the work done by immigrants in US companies. And finally, it is also harder as an immigrant to start your own company. Depending on the type of business, the requirements are much more onerous than for American citizens, like longer waiting times and bond payments that are not required otherwise. These different requirements put the immigrant business owners at a disadvantage with respect to their competitors. Had it not been because of these different requirements, I would have already pushed myself to start my own business that could be generating jobs for other people. I have the knowledge and the experience to do so, but still that's not enough to overcome some of the other barriers. So yes, being an immigrant is hard, but staying back home would have probably been harder. Because I'm here, I've been exposed to technologies and possibilities that were not available to me in Venezuela. As an undergrad in Venezuela, I had to run experiments manually using the lab equipment from the 1970s. In the US, I've used new equipment to gather all that data automatically, and that frees up my time to do other work, analysis, research, and advance the science even further. As an undergrad in Venezuela, I studied papers published in the US, and I was trying to replicate the work done by other people. In the US, I'm working on projects that have never been done before in the world. I'm doing things no other person has ever done. How cool is that? But I feel that my experience as an immigrant has given me some advantages as well. I have been able to participate in groups for Latinos and other minorities, which have been great opportunities for networking and for finding mentors. And I also bring a different perspective, different experiences, and different ways of thinking. This can sometimes be a bit of a disadvantage when I don't understand some of the jokes or the cultural references, and that makes me feel like an outsider. But it also is a great tool for driving innovation and encouraging people I work with to think about things differently. Traveling outside of the US also comes natural to me, and I can connect easily with people from other cultures. This is another advantage in dealing with customers or suppliers from other countries. After living and working for 9 years in the US, I found myself remembering some words from my grandfather, the immigrant. He used to say that immigrants never feel at home in their new country, but they also can't feel at home when they go back, because the new experience changed you. You learn to love the new place where you're living at, and people back at home see you as the one that left. My time in the US has definitely changed me as a person, as a scientist, and as a researcher. I know that if I ever left and migrated to a different country, it would be just as hard, and I would miss it just as much as I missed Venezuela when I left in 2008. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. So it's now about 7:30, so I would like to tell you a story from another person who came to the US, a PhD student in epidemiology at the University of Buffalo, Whit Washidi, can't be with us tonight because he is out doing field research, and he has a story he'd like me to share with you. But I think instead I'm going to put it on our website so we can have a little bit more time for discussion tonight. And part of Whit's story is wanting to serve underserved communities in the US and being proud of being a representative of the US when he goes to other countries to do field research. So before I turn over to getting questions from people both in the room and people watching at home on live feed. I just wanted to make a quick announcement that I'm very excited about. So you know us as the March for Science, and we're very happy that we've had the opportunity to organize around this national movement, and we're very proud to be doing Buffalo and to be having these local conversations. So moving into the future, we are going to continue to host the March for Science annually on Earth Day, but we are going to do that as the nonprofit Science Demands Action. We're very excited to be able to announce that today after getting the paperwork together and getting logos together, and I can bring the logo up on the laptop once it boots up again. But I think our conversation here today is the perfect way to kick off the organization, because our mission is to guide communities in using science for social good. And we want to start with Buffalo, and we're very happy that Buffalo wants to do that. So I couldn't quite get the logo up, but it's very fun. You can see it on our new website that will be coming out soon. Look at our present Facebook page for more information about our new website and everything that will be happening in the future. So I'll be coming around with a mic if anyone in the room has any questions, and if there's any questions coming in from the live feed, I can read those out loud as well.
I'm going to be the devil's advocate and basically reiterate some of the comments that you may hear from people who are not very well versed in immigration. And some of this might be related to Ines, but also to the lawyers in the room. A lot of the things that you would hear is someone to say, well, why don't you just become a citizen? Then you can get the grants. Why is it so difficult to become a citizen? And I think it would be helpful if we briefly just went over what it actually takes and the cost, the time it requires to become a U.S. citizen.
So I'm not a lawyer, so they can probably talk about all the requirements and the steps a lot better than I can. But for an engineering, like if you are an engineer coming into the U.S., right? Like first step is getting that student visa that allows you to join the university. Then for your 5 years of your PhD, you're all set. After that, you need to find a company that will sponsor your work visa. And that is a lottery process. So usually 1 in 3 persons or 3 applicants will get that work visa, right? So there you go. There you have a 66% chance that you're not going to be able to stay. Once you get that work visa, you have 6 years to apply for your green card. It's very expensive. You need lawyers to do the work for you. The application is pages and pages where you have to prove your worth as a researcher. You need to show yourself working for different journals, giving talks. You need to prove yourself as an expert in your field, right? And then depending on the country that you're from, once you've applied for your green card, it can take more than 7 years just to get the green card. So 6 years with the visa, 7 years for the green card, that's 13 years just to get the residency. After that, I don't even know how many years you have to be a resident before you can apply for citizenship. 5 years. So it's a very long process.
I think there is something to sort of be noticed, especially for the STEM fields. So one thing that was mentioned is that, so people say there are legal ways to come to this country and to be on a green card, and you should get in line. Well, the line ends up being, okay, assuming that you actually qualify into one of the many rare sort of categories in which you could actually qualify for a green card as opposed to a temporary admission, the line is also really long depending on what is the per country cap. So just like that there was a cap talked about in terms of waivers that are allocated by states, there is a cap that is allocated per country regardless of how big the country is or how many people want to come from that country. It just so happens that, especially for many of the countries who are sending or interested in sending individuals in the STEM fields, China, India, the cap is insanely long. Some of those categories, in employment-based, maybe 5 or 6 years. Some of the family-based categories were up at 10 or more years. And that's just waiting in line for that visa to open up. You'd be fortunate during that time to have some sort of temp visa to work in the United States. But for a lot of individuals, they may not have that temporary visa, and you're sort of waiting this is assuming that someone's already hired you, that you're going to wait 10 years in the backlog before you'll get that visa. Not a lot of employers are going to do that, and a lot of skilled researchers are going to sit around for 10 years waiting for that to happen. They're going to pursue other goals. So it just so happens that window actually is relatively small. I was in the country a good 15, 16 years before I naturalized. And that wasn't because of a choice not to. It was right when I was actually able to do so. Long story, but I think that story is very common for most immigrants.
Hello?
Oh.
It's on, okay. I just want to add one thing to that, which is that I agree with everything everyone has said. It's a very, very long, complicated, complex process. I want to add another point, which is that there are many, many points in the process in which you can make mistakes. Things happen, and then you're off the track. So I wanted to tell a story about a man that I had the pleasure to represent almost a decade ago now. He was a chemical engineer in the United States working in Connecticut from Pakistan after 9/11 happened. The government made the decision based on information that we still have not been able to obtain, that he was suspicious. They canceled his visa without telling him, arrested him at his home, and detained him for several months before they deported him. He has since gone to Canada, resumed his research in Canada, and lives in Toronto and is a Canadian permanent resident now. He just recently tried to enter the United States as a visitor to see whether the government would allow him to do that on he could come. Actually, I believe he's now a dual citizen of Canada and Pakistan, so he was going to come on his Canadian passport, and they denied him admission at the border. And what he says is that, so this is someone who Canada has decided is someone that they want to welcome in and become a citizen. It's someone that our government decided they wanted to deport. That individual is someone who played by the rules and who filed all the applications and filed all the filing fees. Of course, I don't know what the information was that led the government to make that decision. But there's a lot of capriciousness in the system itself, a lot of discretion. We've talked about the black box. There are many, many points along the way in which the government can just deny your application and move to deport you. And so for many people, they decide they want to stay in the status that they're in because they don't want to have to risk going to the next stage and then getting denied and being deported. So, as a green card holder, you may decide, you know what, especially now, you may want to decide to lay low because you don't want to file that naturalization application. As a lawyer, I'm not saying this is my legal advice, but I'm saying I've heard of a lot of people who have made that decision because they are worried that if they go through the process that the government will, for reasons that they don't even have to explain, deny the application, and then you're left with nothing. And so we have a system that's both long and complex. The line is long, all of the things we're talking about. And also there's a level of capriciousness and discretion that means that it's very unpredictable for people. And so for that reason, I think people also make the decision that if their status is secure, they're not going to rock the boat. They're not going to file that next application because they don't want to give the government another chance to tell them they have to go home.
I also want to add, while you guys were talking, it reminded me of a story of someone that I know that's in the process of applying for his green card. And one of the requirements for that application is that your top job title can't change while that's the case. So this person received a promotion at work and he had to decline it because if he accepted the new position, his application gets completely denied, goes back to the beginning, he has to start all over again. So there are a lot of different things throughout this process that you don't think about until you're actually going through it.
I hire an intern or two every year, and most of my applicants are international students from UB. So as their, as the person that's hiring them and as the person that they're working for, what are some things that I can do to support them and to support their goals and to help make them more successful in this country?
I think for me, a lot of the things that have been helpful are all those extracurricular activities, right? Like I said, I belong to a lot of Latino groups. It's always good to have mentors, people that can guide you through the process. But I think it's also important. I mean, you are in the U.S., right? You want to be exposed to the culture. You don't want to just surround yourself with other people that maybe come from your same country, right? You need to be able to branch out and learn how to adapt and live the life here, right? So I think, like filling in some of those blanks is very helpful.
Oh, maybe I didn't. Okay. We're streaming, that's right. Okay. Yeah, I'm curious, and Dr. Berger's not here right now, but do we have a sense of whether or not the universities and medical communities have any reach in lobbying? Are they having any impact? Or is that on wane with the new administration?
I think we're hello? I think it's still fairly early in the administration to try to figure that out. I will say that many of the people that they've put into place in these agencies that are making decisions about policies and new regulations to put into place have a decidedly anti both legal and illegal immigration stance. My sense is that they haven't been getting a lot of traction on that. I think that the area where they've had the most success so far, and I think that might be about to change, is with DACA, which is the program for young people who were brought as children and who are in school. Most universities in the country have DACA students who are attending. I know UB does. There was a sense that program might be ended immediately. It didn't happen. There are certain things that are happening now that I think are going to more likely than not bring about the end of that program in the next couple months. So I think this will be a moment in which we will see whether universities are going to have much clout with this administration, because I think that this will be an inflection point. It's something to look out for is they're thinking about raising the salary caps for certain visas. So right now you have to make above a certain salary in order to be eligible for certain visa categories, and it's supposed to be a way so that you're not allowing low skilled people to come. It's for high skilled people. They have to be making a certain amount of money. There has been some discussion of doubling that salary cap, which would basically, for many, many positions in universities, particularly public universities, put those visas out of reach for universities. And I think that there's going to be a lot of pushback, obviously, from universities who would see this as a death knell to many of their programs that depend on, international researchers and faculty. So I think we're still feeling that out, but I'm not particularly optimistic based on what I've seen so far.
So I just want to add on to that, because I feel like we're sort of in a dangerous and interesting moment with the way that the political cleavage is dividing this country, and it's in some ways relevant to the STEM field. On the one hand, I feel like not only it may be that research institutions or universities may have less clout, they're also in the recent years been feeling a lot of political pushback. There's been in many states a lot of political success in attacking universities and their sort of independence or the value of research. One thing that I did when I was sort of coming on our presentation is I started thinking about, especially my local angle, of how many sort of cosmopolitan, even ancient cities, right? That kind of environment is sort of development of science or math, right? We think Alexandria or Constantinople. And there's a sort of dark side to that, because when the cleavage in politics or whatever becomes sort of urban and non-urban, when it becomes sort of cosmopolitan areas and non-cosmopolitan areas. I mean, when we think about revolutions in which, many cosmopolitan countries with capitals then suddenly became very sort of repressive or regressive, when that cleavage becomes the sort of primary moment, you have to be a little bit concerned, not only for just the type of society or country that it's going to be in the future, but in some ways that environment for sort of scientific development. It's not linear, right? There's dark ages and there's Renaissance. So even if we think purely from a scientific realm, knowledge gets lost, and there are many moments in history of regression. Oftentimes those take places when there is a political backlash against what is perceived as, sort of particular urban areas that are cosmopolitan or maybe out of step in some ways with the rest of the country.
So we have a question from our audience online. I think this is the last question we'll be able to take before the library starts announcing that they're closing at 8. The question from online is, are immigrants stealing American jobs?
Hello. I think you answered that question with a lot of good statistics at the beginning in your presentation, right? And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but a lot of the, especially for these highly skilled, highly trained engineering, STEM field jobs, first of all, American citizens that have the credentials for those jobs are all hired. The unemployment level is below the 4% that's, required for it to be considered fully hired.
Yeah, and if I can jump in there, I didn't include this on the PowerPoint from earlier, but to be considered a field or an area where everyone is fully employed, it's below 4%. In some of these areas, particularly chemical engineering and other highly specialized jobs, the unemployment rate is 0.01%
right.
versus 4%. So
American citizens that are skilled for these jobs are all employed. There's still need for more people to fill in these positions, and this is where the immigrants are coming.
Yeah, I think there's a danger, and this is very common in immigration politics, to think about jobs or benefits or whatever it may be as a zero-sum game. There's something really interesting about GDP, even though we keep talking about sort of economic growth, is that historically GDP growth actually just comes from population growth. Because population, when you grow, they create more demand, they produce more things, they create sort of opportunities. There's a reason why, in some ways, cities try to recruit more individuals and want to grow. And I think what we often sort of think about is that when it comes to immigration or it comes to sort of concerns, that we start thinking about things in terms of purely a zero-sum game. And when you start thinking like that, then you start not doing the things that would actually produce the type of explosive growth that we had in the past, which is innovation, which is thinking outside the box. Where you're just, and I would say that's something unique, maybe something we should talk about with the immigration system itself. So much of it right now is based around this idea that we fill existing openings, right, by particular employers. What we haven't talked about is how does our immigration system actually foster startups or people who want to come without an employment to start a business, to create something new, right, who isn't already attached to a large corporation. And in some ways, we don't have that opening either.
Some of the stats that Liz presented at the beginning are also talking about how many startups are being created by immigrants, how many jobs are created per immigrant job that's taken in the US, right? So it's definitely not a zero-sum game. It's not just about filling current positions. It's about also creating new positions for American citizens as well.
And in the story you were telling about your own career and what happens when you have access to a giant network of global people doing research, we create so much more.
Just one final Western New York connection. I believe that Buffalo actually would be shrinking at this point if it weren't for the immigrant and refugee population that would be moving to Buffalo. So if we think about our local economy, we've heard a lot about the renaissance of Buffalo as a city that's on the rise. We can talk about whether that's the case or not, but I do think that if that does exist, it's at least in part because of the new population that has been moving to Buffalo, and that is largely an immigrant and refugee population. So I think that what Rick said applies particularly and especially so to Buffalo and Western New York.
Absolutely. Anyone in the audience, the online audience, who's familiar with the population statistics and how much our population decreased will know that that's absolutely the case. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out here tonight to our event, Western New York Without the Einsteins. I'm really glad we had an amazing interdisciplinary discussion, and I hope everyone will be joining us again in the future for Science Demands Action events. Please sign up on your way out, show you were here, and get on our mailing list, Science Demands Action.